You're listening to the Balanced Educator Podcast, episode number 161. Welcome to the Balanced Educator. We're your hosts, Kaylee
and Josiane from EduCalm. Our intention is to equip and empower you to feel more calm, balanced, and joyful in all aspects of your life.
Hello there and welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us today. So a big struggle in the classroom, especially in middle and high school, is managing students' use of technology. Smartphones and other devices can be such powerful tools in the classroom, but they can also be major distractions for students and a constant struggle for teachers. So in this episode, we're interviewing Emily Cherkin, the screen time consultant. Emily has a master's in education and is an internationally recognized consultant who's worked with families and schools over the last 15 years. A former classroom teacher and current parent, Emily helps families go from tech overwhelmed to tech intentional. She's been featured on the Today Show twice, Good Morning America, and in the New York Times. She can be found on the major social media platforms and at thescreentimeconsultant.com. Now, before we get into the interview, we are excited to share this week's sponsor. Do you want to incorporate social-emotional learning and mindfulness into your classroom to support students with mental health, focus, self-regulation, and emotional intelligence? With so much on your plate as a teacher, you probably just don't have time to get trained, develop resources, and teach the lessons yourself. Plus, you need time for self-care too. That's why we developed EduCalm, to support teachers like you. EduCalm is a fully bilingual English and French co-regulation program created by teachers. This program provides everything you'll need to build self-regulation, mindfulness, and social-emotional skills with your students through a 5-minute daily practice. With EduCalm, you don't have to be the expert. Just log in, press play, and participate with your students as you all prepare your minds and bodies for calm and focused teaching and learning together. Go to educalm.com to learn more and start using our free resources. Again, that's educalm.com, spelled EduCalme. All right, let's get into the interview. Hello, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So can you get started by introducing yourself to our audience and just letting us know, how did life lead you to where you are today and what you're bringing into the world today?
Yes. So my name's Emily, and I'm the screen time consultant. And I got to this place today because I'm a teacher first. And so I spent 12 years in the classroom teaching middle school, so 12 and 13-year-olds primarily. And I just loved teaching. I loved working with that age group. It was really one of the best jobs I've ever had, and also one of the hardest. And I'm also a parent. So I have a 10 and a 13-year-old. And what happened really for me was, as I was teaching, I realized in those early days of my first few years, no kid had any sort of technological device, no smartphone, no social media. And by the time I left the classroom 12 years later, almost every single one of my students had their own smartphone. So in about a decade, I witnessed a huge shift in what kids were doing in terms of access to tech and tech that didn't even exist 10 years prior. And so it was really eye-opening as a teacher to see it start to come into the classroom. So kids would come in and say, oh, I saw this picture that was posted about a party I wasn't invited to, and it makes me feel really bad when I see that. Or people would start I hate so-and-so groups on Facebook. This was back when kids were on Facebook. And I just realized we can't not talk about this. This is affecting their relationships and social dynamics in the classroom. And I can teach English all I want, but if they're distracted by this, it's not going to get through. So I started talking to my students about it. And what I realized in talking to them, and first they took a sort of well, this isn't a good thing. You probably shouldn't use it. It's not nice. They were but it's our parents. Our parents are on social media. Our parents are playing games on their phones or texting and driving. It's not just us. And I thought, oh, this is a parenting challenge. And so it really led me to realize that this is something that's not going away. And I have my teaching background, so I have that sort of at the same time all this was happening, the influx of technology into the classroom was also happening. Sort of, online management, learning systems, grade books, that kind of thing. And then you can imagine the pandemic just sort of added fuel to the fire on all of this with remote learning, working from home, screens for socialization. So that perfect storm has led me to be very busy today.
I can imagine. It's so crazy how fast things have changed. Like even from like as an adult who, when I was in school, like I feel like I'm so young still. I'm like, how old am I? I'm 32. I'll be 33 this year. And I still feel like I'm young. And when I was a student, like we were still researching in books and like just starting to learn how to research on the internet. We were like, whenever we'd be doing an assignment, we'd have to research on the internet and have some book sources. And things are so different now that I'm a teacher and I'm in the classroom. It's like, physical books rarely happen. So technology has become so big in the classroom and such an important tool. But I like how you talk about like taking a tech intentional approach, because I feel that when I first started my teaching career, technology was really kind of just starting to launch in the classroom. And in my first couple of years, my principal was sending me to all these conferences about how to bring technology in the classroom. And my first reaction was kind of like, well, a lot of these ideas are just bringing technology for technology's sake, and it's not actually going to improve how students are learning. It's just like switching out paper for a computer. Is that helping them? Where's the data on that? So that's been kind of the lens through which I look at things. Sometimes these trendy things, you're wondering, is this actually going to be useful? So can you chat a little bit about that and that kind of difficulty as a teacher to distinguish?
Yes. And I actually have just written down before you said that, don't use tech for tech's sake. So I'm so glad you said that, because that was my experience as I was ending my time in the classroom, was that, the uptick in online grading and learning management systems. And I felt like as a middle school teacher, the most important thing my kids were going to get out of middle school experience was executive function skills. So planning, prioritizing, organization, emotion regulation, cognitive flexibility, all that good stuff that makes us healthy adults. And I didn't care. I mean, I used to say, I still say, content is a vehicle for skills. So the content was just whatever we needed it to be. It was all about the skills. And when we brought in these online grade things, for example, what I found immediately was that kids no longer came to me to ask about why they got what grade or to ask what their grade was. They went online. And so it totally ended that executive function skill of having a conversation and seeking information and trying to figure out what happened and why did I get this, and so much value in that interaction. And by putting it online, what I noticed was the kids became obsessive too about checking it. And so then it was all about the grade. And look, I know everybody has a different view, and there's some people who are yes grades and some are no grades. I fell somewhere in the middle. But for me, watching kids become obsessed about that just defeated the entire purpose of where's the joy in learning if all you're caring about is this number. And even worse was then parents were able to start accessing it, and I'd start getting emails about why did my kid get a B+ and not an A-, which to me was not a great use of my time or skills. And so I unfortunately I think there are some incredibly remarkable things that technology can do in the classroom. I always say I'm not anti-technology, I am tech intentional. But then that is with a big caveat. There are some very select few things that are really transformative when it comes to technology. And I don't have any objection to using those. But I have to say that I don't think that's the majority of how screens are used in school, primarily. I think some schools do better than others. But for the most part, I think it's a lot of tech for tech's sake. And my biggest fear coming out of the pandemic is that schools have invested a ton of money into tech-based products and tools for remote learning and pandemic life, and they're not going to walk away from it. So now they have all this, they've paid all this money, they're not going to not use it. And so to me, it's, as you point out, it's not about choosing what's best for teaching and learning. It's because we've invested this and we're supposed to, and we don't want to like waste the resource.
Yeah, totally. It's so crazy how quickly it's flipped from, when we were teaching in the classroom, even like 5 years ago, we had a pretty good idea that when students were outside of the classroom, they're like socializing, they're doing activities, they're like doing in-person human physical things. But now with the rise in social media, you don't know that they might not be doing any socialization out of the classroom except for online. And so now there's this whole flip in thinking, at least for myself, of like, how do we make sure that in the classroom, we're providing these experiences for like hands-on learning, physically doing things, learning those executive functioning skills, learning skills for how to manage their screen time and their time outside of the classroom. And really like this, I just feel so much more like hands-on needs to be the balance to this higher amount of screen time in all areas of life.
100%. And it's great talking to you as a teacher perspective, because I hear so much from parents. And I will say one thing that parents feel really overwhelmed by is the fact that schools used to be primarily a screen-free or screen-light experience. And even pre-pandemic, I was hearing from parents who were so overwhelmed by the online school stuff, like just accessing homework, turning things in, that they felt that it was bumping up against their family screen time rule. So they would say, well, we have a limit, but then my kid has to get online to do their homework or to turn something in. And it's making this way more complicated. But then with the pandemic and remote learning and online socialization, there's also the teacher view that parents are providing smartphones and social media access. So where we used to have kids playing sports after school or interacting with friends or extracurriculars, and we used to have kids in school not being on screens, both of those things have changed. And kids are now on screens an extraordinary amount of time. And even pre-pandemic, those numbers were high. But like, again, I always say too, it's not about a little bit of screen time. It's the excessive part that I really worry about. And, I think it is a little different when it screens for an academic purpose, but even that, I like anything can be called academic, right? It's sort of like, what is it you want it to be teaching? And the problem is that social media in particular, but there are even educational platforms that are designed like this as well, are designed to hook and hold our attention and to keep us online longer. And even as adults, how hard is it for us to put down Instagram or stop, not watch just one more episode of a show, because it's designed to autoplay into the next one. There is no an end to our social media feed. And that's intentional. It's done that way on purpose. And so, for adults, it's hard enough. How on earth can we expect children to manage this? The answer is we can't, because their brains are not adult brains.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as you said, as an adult, I feel that it's such a challenge for myself it's like, I know once I turn on Netflix, like that's my evening. Like I have to, I can't sit down and watch TV too early because I can't pull myself away from the television once it started until I get tired and it's bedtime. So I have to be intentional about the time of day that I allow myself to turn on the television, because it's just too hard to take it away. And then same thing with social media. I have to be intentional about when and what is going to be my trigger to show me that, oh, now is the time to turn it off. Because otherwise time just flies by. And as you said, everything is built to keep us on that app for longer, because that's how they're making money. And that's how they're, having success, is by keeping us there. So what do you suggest? Like, how do we make a shift for ourselves first? Because we have to be the model, right? We have to be able to practice these strategies if we want to be able to teach them. And then how do we start teaching our students these skills that are so important in today's reality of life?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I love that you point out that it's us first, because we are the adults. And at the end of the day, I mean, I kind of think about my first years in the classroom of like, I would had a flip phone and I would like turn it off and put it in my bag, and I wouldn't look at it until the end of the school day. And by the time I left the classroom, my phone might be on my desk in the classroom. And I didn't necessarily look at it, but it was there and I could grab it if I wanted it. Totally different, right? And so as you point out, we have to be the models. So one thing I tell parents this, but I actually think there's tremendous value for educators as well, which is this idea of living our life out loud. So when we talk about how we use technology around children and our students, we're modeling what that looks like. So I always say our phones are not switchblades, they're Swiss Army knives, right?
Yeah.
They do like all kinds of things. And so what we need to be able to say to our students and our children is, I'm going to reach for my phone and again, I imagine in a school, teachers are texting each other too, right? So it's like, I'm reaching for my phone, Mrs. So-and-so is texting me and I just need to respond to it. And then I'm going to put it back down. Or, I've turned off all my notifications and sounds so that when we're teaching in the classroom, you're not going to get interrupted by my phone. I mean, ideally we put them away, but the problem is we've also created a world where we're dependent on that for communication with colleagues. And I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not sure that that's necessarily great modeling as adults to be doing that.
I would agree with that. And also, I would add that I know for myself in the classroom, there's a lot of apps that I use as support when I'm teaching that is on my phone. Yeah. So for example, I teach in a French immersion school. So sometimes, and French is my second language, but I've learned my whole life in French and always taught in French. So, but sometimes a student will ask me like, how do you say this word in French? And I don't know. So I model as a learner of a second language. When we don't know how to say the word, we don't just give up, we find the answer. So then I'll say, let's check the dictionary. And then I'll pull out my app on my phone, look it up, and then share it with them. So I want to model that to them. But then, so it's kind of that tools are useful, but then how do we make sure that I'm not, my phone's in my hand, I'm checking my text messages, right? And that can be tough.
Right. Yeah. And I would even push back a little more too, because you were talking about tech for tech's sake. Could you get the same answer from a French English dictionary, the book, like in your classroom?
Yeah.
Right. Because the other thing is we want our kids to know that it's not just the internet that has all the information. Like one dad told me last week that a random YouTuber has more influence on my child than I do. So if we are teaching kids that the tech is our first go-to solution, then they're going to learn that that's where I look up these things. And again, I mean, amazing tool. I totally understand. I've totally done that myself. But that's a moment where I would invite teachers to say, do I need a tech-based option to address that? And what do I teach them by showing them that books can provide us? And books don't have bottomless feeds and distractible pop-ups and other things that could suck us in. So that would be one sort of, I think, just kind of easy fix. It's easy for us to go to those things because they're convenient. But what's that sort of bigger picture that we're seeing when we do that?
Yeah, that's such a good reflective question. I would say when it comes to the dictionary aspect, I'm like, I could just use a physical dictionary. But at the same time, the reality for students is that as a French immersion student, where they're learning it as a second language, all their courses are in their second language. They need to find words a lot. And most of them just get too lazy to lug around a French English dictionary in their bag and to actually flip through the book. So it's kind of like, okay, where do we meet in the middle of me encouraging them to actually seek that answer themselves rather than just asking me, because they love to ask me before trying it themselves.
Right.
So that's a really good line of questioning.
Yeah. And I can understand that. And again, I always tell parents, like, look, 80% of the time we're doing what we want, like parenting how we want and the values that we have. And I would argue that that's going to be true for teachers too. We don't all have perfect days, right? I mean, that's normal. But, again, I would also wonder, because you were talking about that tactile experience as well, like there is value in learning. Like this is one of the things I love, like when you read online versus reading in a book, we actually retain information differently. And so one of the examples I always like to give is, when you read a book and you want to go back and you look at a section and you can't remember what page, but you remember that it was the lower left-hand corner. You know that experience? That's called location memory. And so what happens is when we read digitally, there is no page. On a Kindle, there is no go back to the lower left-hand corner. Right. And so I almost wonder too, again, back to the dictionary, yes, it's more work, but like what would it be like? So if a kid knows it starts with the letter D, that it's going to be in that front section of the book, right? And then learning how to sort of alphabetize within that. And again, that tactile experience of turning the pages will actually make that learning deeper. So again, this is not in any way a criticism. I totally understand. And I haven't been in the classroom in the last few years. So I do imagine I would have used some tools differently if I'd had them. But I'm a big fan of books.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I hadn't thought of that idea of location, and it makes so much sense. Even I kind of intuitively, now that you mentioned that, I'm like, oh yeah, there's certain books that I prefer to purchase as an actual physical book. And usually those are like informational books that I'm going to want to refer to again later. I really don't like having digital copies of informational books or, books that I've bought to learn something new. But novels, I never read more than once. So I always get those on an ebook reader. So yeah, that makes total sense because I didn't think about that type of that memory.
Yes. And to go back to living your life out loud, I think as a teacher, you sharing that exact story with your students is so valuable because you're showing how, again, there's the tool purpose of the tech, but also books as tools, right? And you're right, like to buy an expensive novel that you're only going to read once is very different. I agree with you. I mean, you can see I have all kinds of books behind me because I do go back and I do want to flip through and look at those books that are like the resources and information books. Mm-hmm. So I think that's so valuable. I feel like that's one of the things that we can do as teachers too, is just talk about that experience for us as adult learners, because we're always learning. I mean, that's the thing. When we know better, we do better. That's why I do the work I do. And I'm imperfect at it. I've got kids. We fight about screen time in my house. It's not like I've mastered this art. It's imperfect and it's not without challenge. But every time I learn something new, it makes me more confident in what I'm doing.
Yeah. And also technology is evolving so quickly, right? Like with the pandemic, all of a sudden TikTok blew up and that's, and that's a whole new level of addiction for students. And so new apps, new games, they're always changing. I know there was a game that my students started playing during the part of the pandemic where we were in person, but they had to stay 2 meters apart at all times. Their mask had to be on at all times. And they had to stay at their assigned seat. And they stayed in the same classroom in the same spot all day, but the teachers moved. So it was so hard for them to socialize. So one day I came into the classroom and they're all just looking at their phones. And I'm like, guys, like, here's your chance to talk. And they're like, oh, we're all playing a game together. And the whole class was playing a game together. And that was their way. And then they would talk, like they would laugh about the game after. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is their solution, a way to socialize within the classroom context in a way that allows them to do that. So it's, constantly balancing those what's right and what should I be encouraging and discouraging.
Yeah. And then I thought a lot about this at the start of the pandemic as I just like, how would I have handled this as a teacher who was so physically involved in my student life, like moving around and talking. And I just couldn't imagine what this would be like. And, what would we have done 5 or 10 years ago? If the pandemic had hit, we didn't have remote learning or we didn't have individual devices for kids or not as many kids. I mean, there's some huge equity issues with this as well. When we expect that students have smartphones and we ask them to use them as tools in the classroom, not every, yes, 90-something% do, but there are some who do not. And that is a problem. I think that's something that we have to be pretty sensitive to. And there are some parents who really do want less of that in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And they feel like now they're in the minority of saying, wait a minute, I need paper. I want pencils. I don't want the tablets.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. So I'd love to know, what is an approach, kind of like a methodology that a teacher could follow when they're like, okay, the reality of my classroom is my students are on their phones a lot. It's a distraction in the classroom. I can see that they need support in managing their willpower to stay off their phone so that they can be present in this lesson, in this moment, and with the people physically around them. So what steps can teachers take to start actually talking about this in the classroom and giving their students actionable plans and systems kind of that they can follow to make sure that they're managing their screen time in an intentional way?
Well, I have to say, I actually would zoom out farther. And I would say, I think there needs to be school-wide policies because the burden falls to individual teachers to enforce individual classroom policies. And then what happens is it's inconsistent. Different teachers have different ways of doing it. And then the kids are like, well, I can use my phone in so-and-so's class, but we got to be sneaky about it in the other class. When there is a school-wide policy of phones are away for the day, which is, in my opinion, really the best policy to have, it takes away all of that distraction and issue of having the device physically in the classroom, which means, that's an adult problem to solve, right? That's an adult conversation, and you'll get pushback from teachers and you'll get pushback from parents. And I know that, but research supports that's the right and best way for children. And so my entire focus of my work is what is best for children. Like, that's it. At the end of the day, it's what's right for kids. And that's it. If the kids, for students who are older or in schools where there aren't policies, I think, again, always inviting them to be a part of the conversation is important, so doing things where it's like, okay, I know I've seen teachers with like the little shoe pockets, you put your phones in here for the day, but even the presence of a phone can decrease our focus and our ability to pay attention. I mean, the research shows that too. So, having the conversations with our students about what do you notice when your phone is here on the table versus in your backpack versus in your locker? Like, let's do an experiment. And there is actually data about that those very categories. So getting them involved in the process will increase the buy-in for sure. They don't want teachers, or adults telling them, don't do this, don't do that, right? And, I think the other thing is too, remembering, I feel like sometimes schools use tech as a way of communicating with families. There's Instagram pages for sports teams or clubs. And I have to say, I think it's really hard to ask kids not to do it if school messaging is that's what we're doing. So again, there's this whole, what is the culture that we want? And how are our values reflected in those policies? And, at the end of the day, in my opinion, there is enough red flags. We don't have long-term research yet because this is such a new phenomenon, but there are enough red flags that less is really more for kids when it comes to learning. And again, going back to that persuasive technology, the way these things are designed, you mentioned willpower. And the thing I often say to parents is it's not a fair fight. It's not actually about your kid being weak-willed or, a problem. They are being hijacked. Their brain is being hijacked. And so I believe talking to students about that is so valuable, that giving them the vocabulary to talk about dopamine and what's happening when they get likes and notifications is so valuable, because then they get mad. And then they get mad and they get motivated to change it. That's wonderful. Harnessing the power of youth. Heck yeah.
Totally. I love that. I love the idea of experimenting with it. So rather than telling them, having a mindful approach and saying, let's test this out. Let's see, day one, you have your phone screen up right next to you. You can use it as much as you want. Day two, it's in the backpack. Day three, it's in the locker. And let's gather data and reflect on how that affected your ability to be present and whether it actually felt better to have your phone next to you or felt better to be able to take a break from the phone.
Yes.
That's one thing that we practice mindfulness in my classroom every day, using our program, the EduCalm program. And during that time, I say, hey, here's your chance to just take a break. You don't need to do anything. Here's your chance to just put the phone away. You have 5 minutes where you aren't a slave to your notifications. You get 5 minutes to rest. And when I explain it like that, rather than you should have your phone away, it's a distraction, this is bad, they really accept it differently. They go, oh yeah, Absolutely. That's a good point. I am a slave to my phone a lot of the time. It is kind of nice to take a break.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, again, too, just in general, there's more buy-in from kids when they're a part of the decision making, when they're a part of the process. So again, if content is a vehicle for skills, even in this context, use the experience of the phone as a distraction as the content, but you're teaching skills. You can write about what that experience is like. You can collect data, right? You can actually numerically quantify the experience, test them on math facts 3 days in a row, but different scenarios, right? It's a way of including them so that the buy-in is there, so that they understand when the policies are made, why they're being made and why they're beneficial.
Yeah. And maybe even coming up after doing that experimentation phase, having a discussion with the class of what do we want our class, if there isn't already a policy in the school, what do we want our class policy to be? What is going to serve us best as students and learners in the classroom? And what's going to support your mental health? Because from what I hear, students are attached very much to their social media, but not always because they want to be. It's that fear of missing out. It's that feeling scared that they're going to miss something. And that doesn't actually feel good.
No. And from the mental health perspective too, I think what I am realizing, and parents have a really hard time with this, and I understand there's a lot of variables why, but even it is developmentally normal for kids to not like rules and to resist boundaries. That's healthy, normal child development. They will say, I don't want you to set limits on my phone, or I don't want you to take away social media. But I believe for the most part that they want a break and they need permission to get off. And if we have to be the bad guys who are the mean ones who said you have to stop, I think there's relief in that. And you're absolutely right. Snapchat has snap streaks, right? Which is like, if you don't post every day or every 24 hours and you like break your streak, that's persuasive design. And it causes tremendous anxiety in kids, right? But is that what we want 12 and 15-year-olds to be obsessing about at night? Is like losing their streak or going on vacation and being paranoid that they're somehow missing something? So sometimes we actually have to help them make that break to see you will survive. And you might actually feel better, right? So I think I have never had a parent. I know I've never had a parent tell me, I wish I'd given my kid a phone younger or smartphone or social media access sooner. No one has ever said that to me. They have all said, I wish I knew more before I had done it, or I wish I had waited.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. And how do parents even tell their kids like you're not allowed to use social media because all of their friends are using it? That would be such a hard line to put down. Like you're not allowed because they're missing out socially if they're not part of that. Oh, that's a toughie.
It is really hard. And the hardest part for me is in 10 years, how much that switched to nobody had it. And now all but a few do. And the few who don't want it or can't have it are now missing out. And the problem is parents give the phones for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it is because it's what everyone else does, even though that's really only a 5-year-old phenomenon. But the problem is what parents don't always realize is you increase FOMO when you give them access to social media, right? Now they're aware of everything they're missing out on or excluded from. I'm you just gave them unlimited access to the internet. That's not a great way to help build self-esteem, mental health, all of that stuff. I'm going to go back to the schools too. I think schools need policies because it helps families. And I think if the school had a bigger policy about no phones it made it less appealing. It made it less attractive. It made, it wasn't as convenient, then it would be easier for families to say no, and I really feel like I can bridge this world having been an educator, but also being a parent, and I have very mixed feelings. I know there are a few kids in my son's 8th grade class who don't have a phone. They do exist, and they definitely feel left out. And I will say my son doesn't have social media. He's not interested in it, thank goodness. So I don't have to have that fight right now. But, I don't like that he's looking at it more, looking at his phone or texting or reading things on his phone. And, we have lots of conversations about that. And, I think there are probably some happy mediums. I hate to say go back to the old school flip phone, but, because I think kids think that's so uncool, but you can still text with your friends. There are some ways around it. But I think we've normalized it way too quickly. There are again, there was just even an article today about, TikTok and safety issues. And there's just so much. I really believe that the big tech moment is coming, or is happening right now, is the big tobacco of my childhood and that experience. And there's going to be retroactive stuff from this. And so those courageous few parents who are holding back or saying no a little longer, I feel like are going to be vindicated later. There's going to be, yeah, you were right. And it's hard to be alone in that. I get it. I feel that way a lot. But I say to my kid, I am fighting for your future cognitive and emotional health, period. That's why I'm holding off.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah. It's a really tough conversation. It's a really tough thing to consider and decide kind of what side you want to be on when it comes to this as a teacher or as a parent. So I really appreciate you coming onto the show and sharing your ideas and sharing your viewpoints as a specialist in this that gets to work with lots of families. So we can, as teachers, kind of know what's going on for families and what we can do at school. Now, is there any, if a teacher is going to do one thing in the classroom, if they're going to take one thing away from this episode, what would you recommend as either a starting point or the one thing that they feel like, okay, that's one thing I can fit into my schedule in the classroom?
Yes. Okay, here. It's actually 3 questions, but they're quick. So before you choose a tech-based option, what do I gain? What do I lose or replace? What do I model? So we can answer all of those. I mean, again, your dictionary example, right? Like you could go through each of those. Yeah. And sometimes the answer might be a tech-based tool. But if you go through those and you evaluate them and you think, oh, maybe this is an example of tech for tech's sake, and I can do something with a book, or I can do something that isn't on an app, there's a benefit to that, right? And what are we modeling about how we choose as adults to use tech as a tool? So that is a quick and easy 3 questions. What do I gain? What do I lose or replace? And what do I model?
I love that. Thank you so much. That's such a great starting point to just evaluate our own practices. And then, of course, it always snowballs into how we can support our students more and give them strategies that they can try out and test out for themselves. This has been so useful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. How can our listeners connect with you after this episode?
Yes. So irony is not lost on me that you can find me online. I'm on my website is thescreentimeconsultant.com. I'm on the major social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And I try to post sort of daily content that's useful and helpful. But yeah, I support parents. I do school presentations actually for parent education type nights. So I love doing that. And I love working with schools and I love hearing from teachers. So even if it's just sending me an email about your experience, it's really helpful for me to know what's going on, in the, heart of the classroom, because I'm not in there anymore. So I do value that a lot. And thank you, teachers, for everything you've done. I know it's been a rough couple of years.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I hope this episode is going to help you to reflect on your practices and help you to become a little more tech intentional and maybe help your students to become a bit more tech intentional as well. You can find show notes for this episode by going to educalm.com/TBE161. So that's educalm.com. Educalm is spelled EDUCALME.com/TBE as in the Balanced Educator 161. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We appreciate you and all of the amazing things you're doing in the world just by being yourself and bringing yourself and your awesomeness into the world. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with a friend or colleague that would get value from this free resource too. We look forward to connecting with you again in our next episode. Take care.